My son helped her. $720,000. And a name I had never heard before. After my husband suddenly passed away, I buried my husband on a Wednesday. By Friday night, a woman called my home phone. She said she was his wife too. She knew about the cabin in Tennessee, the bank account with $720,000, and a name I had never heard in my life. Lucinda. I stood in my own kitchen, staring at a stranger's name on a legal document that claimed half of everything I'd built for 40 years. And worse, my own son told me to stay quiet, to give up the fight. He said I was too old to understand how the world works now. What kind of man lives two lives and dies before either wife can ask why? But maybe the real question was this: how many decades can a woman live silently before the silence finally breaks? If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I buried Ray on a Wednesday morning, a small ceremony at the cemetery on Hillcrest, just outside of town. Cold wind, overcast sky, and not enough people to make the silence feel respectful. Most of our old neighbors had moved away, and the few that stayed were either too sick or too distant to show up. It didn't bother me. I preferred quiet. Ray wasn't a man who liked attention, and I wasn't the kind of widow who needed a crowd to feel validated. Our son, Jeremy, flew in the night before with his wife, Colleen. They didn't stay long after the service. Jeremy had meetings, and Colleen said she didn't want to leave the dog alone for too long. They hugged me at the graveside, said something vague about checking in next week, then disappeared down the gravel road before the last shovel of dirt had settled. I spent the rest of the day packing up Ray's medications, returning oxygen tanks, and folding laundry that hadn't been touched in weeks. There was comfort in doing so. Folding towels, washing mugs, dusting windowsills. Grief hadn't hit me yet, or maybe it had, just in quieter ways. I wasn't the sort to cry in the kitchen or throw myself onto the bed. I just moved a little slower. It took longer to decide what to eat. Paused in doorways. It wasn't until Friday evening that something shifted. I'd just finished a bowl of vegetable soup and was halfway through the crossword puzzle when the house phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID. Unknown. No city, no name. My first thought was that it was one of those telemarketers, but something about the timing made me answer. The voice on the other end was steady. Low, almost polite. Hello, is this Sylvia Morrison? Yes, I said cautiously. I'm Joanne Blake, the voice replied. I'm sorry to call you like this. I just heard about Ray's passing. I didn't know how else to reach you. That sentence stopped me cold. Not the fact that she knew Ray had died. That could have come from the obituary. It was how she said it, like she had a right to grieve him too. She continued before I could form a reply. I was Ray's wife. We were married in Tennessee in 1994. We lived part-time in a cabin near Pulaski. You probably didn't know about me. He said he would tell you eventually. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. She kept talking, calm, as if this was a normal call to make. There's also the matter of the joint account. He added me years ago. It has around $720,000 in it. I believe it's under review now, since the death certificate was filed. I couldn't speak. My ears were ringing. The soup in my stomach turned to ice. Before she hung up, she said one more thing. Her tone softened, almost as if she pitied me. I hope you'll understand. I didn't mean for it to come out like this. But he wouldn't want Lucinda left in the dark. Lucinda. That was the first time I heard the name. It landed in the air like a slap. I had never met Lucinda in my life. Not through Ray, not through anyone. She ended the call without another word. I stared at the phone for a long time after the line went dead. The first thing I did was open Ray's old desk drawer, the one he kept locked for years, but never after he got sick. I dug through folders, tax returns, bank statements, nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that said Tennessee or Pulaski or Joanne Blake. Just our joint account, our bills, the paperwork I had signed blindly for decades. I sat back in his old chair and let the weight settle on my chest. 41 years. I had lived 41 years beside that man. I had cooked for him, waded through every one of his surgeries, packed his lunch when he still worked for the railway, and now I was being told I wasn't the only one. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the dark, watching headlights from the road slide across the bedroom wall. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Not her real face. I didn't know what she looked like. But I imagined her, blonde maybe, or red-haired, younger. A woman who smiled at my husband across the kitchen table in some mountain cabin while I was here making dinner alone. A woman who knew the password to a bank account I didn't even know existed. By sunrise, something in me had hardened. Not anger, not yet. It was something colder, a sense that the ground I'd been standing on all my life had just cracked beneath my feet. I wasn't falling, not yet. But I was listening to the creak in the floorboards, the soft shift of memory. I knew now that I hadn't known everything, and if I wanted to survive whatever this was, I'd have to learn quickly. So I put on a pot of coffee. I opened the blinds, and I sat down with a notebook, wrote her name in the center of the page, Joanne Blake, and under it, with a shaking hand, I wrote the other one, Lucinda. By mid-morning, I had already called the bank. I didn't use my usual branch. I called the number printed on Ray's last statement, the one from a separate account I'd never noticed before. It was registered under the same bank name but had a different routing code. The customer service woman was polite, younger, probably no older than my granddaughter. She asked for verification. I gave her Ray's full name, social security number, and date of death. She hesitated for just a second, then said she would have someone from the Trust and Estate Division return my call. No one ever says that unless something's off. By noon, the phone rang again. This time it was a man. He introduced himself as Mr. McDougal and explained that a freeze had been placed on a high-value joint account associated with Ray's profile. He confirmed there was a pending dispute and that an individual named Joanne Blake had already submitted partial documentation claiming surviving spouse rights. I asked what kind of documentation. He said copies of a marriage certificate, identification, and a notarized letter requesting disbursement. I said I'd never heard of her, never seen those documents, and never been told of this account. He paused before responding. His tone changed. Cautious now. He said my best course of action would be to have legal representation contact their office directly. He couldn't release more information without that in place. I thanked him calmly, hung up, then sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee until it went cold. I pulled out Ray's old filing box and dumped everything onto the floor. The folders were brittle with age, some crumpled, some yellowed at the edges. I went through every single page. His pension letters, the insurance policy from his railroad days, a canceled check from 1991. Nothing that mentioned Tennessee. Nothing with the name Joanne. No hidden second phone. No photos. No receipts out of place. The only thing that made me pause was a worn envelope labeled property taxes. Storage. It was thin, folded over at the top, like it had been resealed more than once. Inside were 3 receipts. All of them were addressed to a P.O. box in Pulaski, Tennessee. The name on the account was Raymond D. Morrison. My Ray. The payments were for a small log cabin, paid annually, The last one dated 7 months before he died. It wasn't in his will. It wasn't in our joint estate. It wasn't on any list he gave me when we sat down last winter to talk about what came next. I remembered that night clearly. He had a glass of ginger ale and his notepad, scribbled out passwords, account numbers, and a list of who to call. Never once did he say, "Oh, by the way, there's a cabin in Tennessee with another woman waiting for a cut of our life." I took out a second notebook and started a new list. On the left, everything I knew. On the right, what I didn't. The second column was already filling faster than the first. Who was Joanne Blake? Where was Pulaski? Why a second account? Why now? And then, written last, like a wound I wasn't ready to look at directly. Lucinda. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what connection she had to any of this. But the way Joanne said her name, like it explained everything, stuck in my mind. The only Lucinda I had ever known was a waitress at a diner we stopped at in Arkansas on a road trip in 1987. And even then, I doubted she'd reappear 30 years later with a lawyer. I took the folder with the receipts and stored it in my bedroom closet behind the winter coats. Then I pulled out Ray's laptop. It still worked. He had left it unplugged for months, but it powered on after a few minutes. The desktop was clean. No strange apps or private folders. His email was open. Most of it was junk mail. But one address came up more than once. J. Blake, 1970. The name showed up in 3 email threads. None of them recent. The last one was almost 2 years ago. A simple message. Still planning for August. Lucinda wants to see the fireflies again. I closed the laptop. There was something in me that wanted to scream, but I didn't. I didn't throw anything. Didn't rip the folder or delete the email. I sat there instead, quiet, still, letting it rise and settle, the way the tide does when it has nowhere else to go. At dinner, I barely tasted the food. I kept thinking about the fireflies. That meant summer. That meant she had spent time with him in that cabin, while I was probably here doing the laundry or picking up his prescriptions. All those weekends he said he was driving to see an old railroad buddy. All those times he told me not to come along because it was boring man stuff. I believed him. And now I had to decide whether that made me naive or just loyal. I washed the dishes slowly. I dried each one by hand, though I had a dishwasher. Some habits don't change just because your world does. After everything was put away, I took a walk, just down the block. The streetlights buzzed softly. The neighbor's cat darted across my front lawn. It was quiet in the way only older neighborhoods are at night. No music, no kids, just the hum of refrigerators and the occasional flicker of TV light behind curtained windows. I stood on the corner for a minute, looking back at my house. It looked the same. Pale blue siding, a little crooked on the left where the roof needed fixing. But inside, something had shifted. Something had cracked open, and now everything was different. I walked back up the steps and into my living room. I opened the notebook again, drew a line under the names. "This isn't over," I wrote. Then I turned out the light. The next morning, I drove to the storage unit Ray had leased on the east side of town. It was the one near the old car wash, tucked between 2 rows of warehouses that hadn't seen fresh paint in a decade. I'd passed by that place for years and never once thought it belonged to us. But his name was on the receipts. 3 annual payments, always in cash. I still had the spare key. Ray had handed it to me once years ago, told me it was for backup tools and winter tires. That was back when I trusted the way people explain small things. I parked in front of Unit 14 and stared at the metal door. The padlock was old but intact. My fingers trembled a little when I slid the key in. It turned too easily. The door groaned as it rolled up. The light inside was dim. Dust swirled through the air like snowflakes caught in slow motion. The first thing I noticed was a tarp-covered love seat, one we donated to Goodwill in 2008. The second thing was a wooden trunk with Ray's initials carved into the side. But it wasn't the kind of trunk you'd put holiday lights in. This one looked hand-built, heavy, worn at the corners. I peeled back the lid. Inside were old photo albums, notebooks, and 2 shoeboxes packed tight with envelopes and receipts. There was also a small jewelry box. I lifted it carefully. Inside were earrings I'd never seen, a bracelet with the initials JB, and a single folded photograph. It was of Ray. He was standing beside a young woman with auburn hair, her hand resting casually on his chest. Behind them was a wooden cabin porch, faded white paint peeling from the railing. On the steps sat a girl, maybe 10 or 11, holding a mason jar glowing with fireflies. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking up at him. I stared at that photo for a long time. There was a date on the back. July 2012, Pulaski. I set the box down and opened the notebooks. The first was blank. The second was a journal, Ray's handwriting, the same scrawl he used to leave grocery lists on the fridge. But this wasn't a list. It was a life. Entries were dated between 2009 and 2016. Every few pages mentioned the same names: Joanne, Lucinda, Cabin. There were notes about school projects, doctor visits, the best months to catch trout in the river. He'd written about missing birthdays, about guilt, about love. None of it was for me. Halfway through, I found a page that made me stop breathing. Joanne wants to tell her soon. I said no. I told her we would wait. Sylvia can't know. She wouldn't understand. I closed the book. There was a pressure behind my ribs, tight and sharp, like something was pressing from the inside. My hands were still on the page, but my mind had already left the room. I saw Ray sitting in that cabin, stringing lights on a porch I'd never seen. I saw him reading bedtime stories, building swings, smiling in a life that had nothing to do with me. For a second, I hated him. Not in the loud, fiery way that burns hot and then fades. It was colder than that. A quiet, steady ache that rooted itself deep and refused to move. I stacked the boxes carefully, loaded them into the trunk of my car. I didn't bother locking the unit again. There was nothing left worth hiding. Back home, I spread the photo albums on the living room rug. The first few pages were filled with printed snapshots. Birthdays, road trips, Christmas mornings. I flipped through them quickly, searching for faces I didn't recognize. Then I found a small black notebook wedged in the back. It was thinner than the rest. Inside were scribbles, to-do lists, directions. On the last page, in faded blue ink, was a series of numbers. 37.0164, 87.0057. It looked like code, or maybe coordinates. I copied it into my phone, not sure what I expected. When the map loaded, I felt my chest tighten again. Pulaski, Tennessee. The red pin landed on a dirt road outside the town limits, close to a lake, near a small structure labeled privately owned. That had to be the cabin, the one in the picture, the one with the fireflies. I closed the map. My phone buzzed a moment later, a message from Jeremy. "Mom, I need to talk. Can I stop by tomorrow?" He hadn't called since the funeral. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned back to the floor, laid out the photo, the journal, and the notebook. I tried to make sense of it all, to see the shape of this other life Ray had been living. But all I could see was a silence so wide and deep, it made the room feel foreign. That night, I didn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't grief that kept me awake. It was the realization that I had been erased from half of my own husband's life, that every year I thought he was mine, he was also theirs. And maybe, just maybe, he had loved them differently. I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. But I was done pretending this was a misunderstanding. There were too many receipts, too many pictures, too many words written in his own hand that didn't include me. In the dark, I whispered the name one more time. Lucinda. Then I got up, and for the first time in 2 days, I packed an overnight bag. I left at dawn. The drive to Pulaski took just under 6 hours. I packed light. One overnight bag, a thermos of black coffee, and the photo of the cabin folded inside my notebook. I didn't tell Jeremy. I didn't leave a note. I didn't even feed the cat. I figured one day without dry food wouldn't kill him. It felt strange, heading down a highway toward a place my husband had once called home, and I had never even known existed. Every mile ticked past like a lie unraveling. Somewhere in the hills ahead was a house with memories I wasn't part of. Somewhere out there, someone still used his name like it belonged to them. By the time I crossed into Tennessee, the sun was high. I turned off the main road and followed the map's coordinates down a narrow path lined with sycamores. The road grew bumpier, the trees denser. At some point, the asphalt gave way to gravel, and then dirt. A rusted gate stood open, leaning sideways like someone had given up on fixing it long ago. I drove past it slowly, tires crunching the gravel until the trees thinned and I saw it. The cabin. It was smaller than I expected. 1 story, faded wood siding. A porch swing hung on the left side. Its chain rusted at one end so it tilted sideways. Wind chimes clinked lazily near the door. The grass was tall, untouched, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, like someone had meant to come back but got interrupted. I parked, turned off the engine and listened. No cars, no voices, just birds and wind and something that felt too much like grief. I stepped out and walked to the porch. There was a ceramic frog next to the welcome mat, the kind kids paint at summer camp. One of its eyes had chipped off. The door wasn't locked. It opened with a quiet creak that made my stomach turn. Inside, it smelled like cedar and dust. The furniture was simple. A small couch with a blanket draped neatly over the arm. A coffee table with a cracked magazine from 2 summers ago. And photos. Everywhere. On the mantel above the fireplace, there were frames lined up in perfect rows. Ray in flannel, smiling in ways I'd never seen. Ray holding hands with a woman I now knew was Joanne. Ray with a girl beside a birthday cake, pink icing smeared across her cheek. Lucinda. I walked slowly, eyes moving from one frozen memory to the next. There were photos of fishing trips, pumpkin carvings, a Christmas morning with flannel pajamas and open stockings. A life, not secret in the shadows, but displayed proudly, as if this was the version that mattered most. My legs carried me to the back hallway, where 2 bedrooms stood opposite each other. One had a double bed, neatly made. The other had pale yellow curtains and a desk covered in old-school papers. I picked one up. It was a crayon drawing labeled My Family. A man, a woman, and a child. All smiling, holding hands. No space for a second wife. No space for me. I stood there, completely still, while something broke loose inside my chest. It wasn't rage. Not yet. It was a strange kind of grief. One that didn't come with tears. Just weight. A heavy, sick realization that I had spent 4 decades married to a man who lived 2 lives, and I'd only ever been allowed half of him. I opened the drawer on the desk and found letters. One was addressed to Lucinda, written in Ray's handwriting. The envelope hadn't been sealed. Inside was a birthday card with $20 tucked into the fold. There was a date scribbled in the corner. Last summer. He had mailed her money while I was upstairs helping him manage his insulin, while I was trimming his toenails, paying the gas bill, folding his flannel shirts into drawers he no longer opened. He had been sending birthday cards to a child I didn't even know existed. I put the letter down gently, then walked back to the living room. I needed air, the kind that didn't smell like betrayal. Outside, the wind had picked up. A storm was rolling in from the hills. I stood on the porch, watching the trees sway, their leaves curling under gray clouds. The world around me felt wrong, too soft, too quiet, like it didn't understand what I'd just seen. I sat on the porch swing, careful not to lean too far left where the chain hung loose. My hands rested in my lap, trembling slightly. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I tried to imagine what it felt like to be Joanne, to live here with him, to hear his voice in the morning, to wait for him to come home and believe she was the only one. Then I thought of Lucinda, that little girl with the fireflies. How old she must be now. 15, maybe 16. A teenager with a father buried under my name, and a mother who knew I existed the whole time. What did Joanne tell her? That he had another wife, but it didn't count? That some marriages came with footnotes? I stood slowly and took one last look at the house. This wasn't mine. It never had been. But it was part of my story now, whether I wanted it or not. I locked the front door out of habit, even though I didn't know if anyone would ever come back. In the car, I sat for a long while before starting the engine. I stared at the reflection of the cabin in my rearview mirror and whispered the only thing I could manage. I see it now. Then I drove away. The sun was already sinking low when I pulled into my driveway. The house looked exactly the same as when I left. Quiet, unbothered, as if it had no idea what I'd seen, no memory of what had been torn open just hours ago. I carried my overnight bag into the kitchen, set it down on the counter, and stood there for a moment, staring at the calendar on the fridge. It still showed March, the same month Ray had died. I hadn't turned the page in 4 weeks. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. There was too much silence, the kind that didn't just come from being alone, but from realizing you had been alone long before you noticed. The cat didn't greet me. The thermostat clicked on, but the warmth didn't reach my skin. I took a long shower, trying to scrub off the scent of that cabin, the weight of those photographs, the ghost of that child's laughter, but nothing washed away. Everything clung. The towel, the clothes, the air. That night, I made tea, not because I wanted it, but because it gave my hands something to do. I sat at the dining room table with the lamp on low and reread Ray's journal. I kept thinking I would find something redeeming, some line that explained it all, that told me I mattered in some other, deeper way. But all I found were pages filled with a life I had never been invited into. At 8:03, headlights appeared in the driveway. I heard the car door slam, footsteps on the walkway, then the doorbell. I didn't rush to answer. When I opened it, Jeremy stood there, hands in his jacket pockets. He looked tired, older than he should have for 42, but I didn't feel relieved. I felt guarded. He stepped inside, glanced around the room like he expected something to have changed. I gestured toward the living room, and he followed. We sat across from each other, the coffee table between us, too wide and too small all at once. He spoke first, said he was sorry for not calling sooner. Those things at work had been overwhelming. That grief made him shut down sometimes. I nodded, but didn't speak. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and asked if I'd been managing all right. I told him I had taken a drive. His eyes flicked to mine. I said I went to Tennessee. He sat back slowly. Then he asked what I was doing there. I told him I'd found the cabin, Ray's second life. Joanne, Lucinda. His jaw tensed. He didn't look surprised. Not exactly. I asked him if he knew. The words came out flat, cold. He didn't answer right away. Then he said he had his suspicions. I stared at him, my stomach folding into itself. He said when he was 16, he found a postcard addressed to Ray from someone named Joe. He asked about it back then. Ray brushed it off, said it was nothing. Jeremy let it go. He said he didn't want to cause problems, said Dad worked hard, and maybe he deserved some privacy. He didn't think it was worth ruining everything over something that might not even be real. I asked if he ever wondered if it was real. He looked down at the floor. Then he told me something I didn't expect. 3 years ago, Ray had asked him for help wiring money to someone. Said it was for an old friend in Tennessee. Jeremy helped. He didn't ask questions. He didn't want to know. I felt my hands go cold. He had known. Not everything, but enough. And he hadn't warned me. I stood up, walked into the kitchen, poured cold tea down the sink. My back was to him, but I could feel him watching. When I turned around, he was standing now too, closer than before. He said he was sorry. I told him that sorry meant nothing after silence. He flinched. I asked him how many times he had looked me in the eye, knowing there was something I didn't know, knowing his father had been lying, knowing I was living in the dark. He said he didn't want to break my heart. I told him it had been broken anyway, and that now it was his silence that made the pieces cut deeper. He tried to reach for my arm. I pulled away. That was the first time I ever stepped back from my son. He said he loved me. I told him love without protection was just a word. And I didn't want words anymore. The room went still. Then he picked up his jacket and left. I didn't walk him to the door. I didn't watch him drive away. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after, staring at the clock. It ticked softly, steady as ever. Like nothing had changed. But something had. It wasn't just about Ray anymore. It wasn't just about Joanne or Lucinda. It was about the people who let me walk around blind. The ones who smiled and nodded and pretended silence were kind. That night, I packed up the journals and receipts and photos into a single box. I labeled it Truth. Then I slid it under the bed and turned out the light. The ache didn't fade. But at least now I knew where it came from. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I hadn't slept much, but something had shifted in me. The kind of shift that doesn't come with noise, just a quiet click somewhere in your chest, like a gear finally slipping into place. I no longer felt numb. I felt precise, focused, like a woman who had spent too long being sentimental and was finally ready to be strategic. I made coffee, the old-fashioned way, with the percolator Ray hated. I liked the sound it made, like something working steadily, drop by drop. While it brewed, I opened the kitchen drawer where I kept old paperwork. Warranties, bills, expired coupons, the clutter of domestic life. But tucked beneath a pile of tax returns was the envelope Ray had kept locked in his filing cabinet. I hadn't looked through it since the week after his funeral. Inside was a small black ledger. It wasn't labeled, just a plain notebook, filled with Ray's handwriting. The first few pages were basic. Oil changes, lawn equipment purchases, home maintenance records. But 10 pages in, the tone changed. There were transfers listed in cash, weekly amounts, some in the hundreds, some over 1,000. None of them made sense at the time. Now, I read them differently. Each transaction had initials beside it. JBLT. There were months where the payments came like clockwork, then silence for weeks, then a larger amount. I reached the last page and found something different. It was a contract. Not formal, not notarized, just a sheet of paper, printed from a home computer, with both their names typed at the top, Raymond T. Morrison and Joanne Blake. The agreement stated that in the event of Ray's death, Joanne would receive a sum of $72,000 annually for 10 years. The payments were to come from the trust Ray had established 5 years ago, a trust I hadn't even known existed. There was a clause at the bottom. It read, "This arrangement supersedes all verbal agreements." It wasn't signed, just dated. I stared at that date for a long time. It was the same week Ray had come home from a fishing trip with a limp, said he'd twisted his knee stepping off the boat. I helped him into the house, rubbed his swollen leg with menthol cream, and cooked his favorite meatloaf. And he had sat there, nodding and thanking me, while carrying a piece of paper that cut me out of the equation entirely. I copied every page, scanned them to a flash drive, labeled the folder for attorney review. Then I drove to the bank. I didn't dress up, didn't bother with makeup. I wore Ray's old windbreaker and carried the ledger in a zippered canvas bag. The woman behind the desk was young, cheerful, unaware that she was about to hand me a piece of my own erasure. I told her I was the widow of Raymond T. Morrison and needed access to any trust or account opened under his name. I presented the death certificate and the marriage license. She hesitated, then excused herself to speak with the branch manager. 10 minutes later, she returned with a folder. Ray had opened a private trust 3 months after his second heart attack. The documents listed 2 beneficiaries, Joanne Blake and Lucinda Thompson, not Sylvia Morrison. I asked for printed copies. She gave them to me without question. When I got home, I spread everything across the dining room table. The trust papers, the ledger, the journal, the photograph of the cabin, the birthday card to Lucinda. It was like looking at a puzzle, but the pieces no longer felt confusing. They made sense now, not emotionally, but logically. This man had led a second life, and he had planned for it, protected it, funded it, while letting me play nurse, cook, and hostess in the life he slowly abandoned. I didn't cry. I opened my laptop and searched for a lawyer, not a general family attorney. I needed someone who understood hidden trusts, contested wills, and marital fraud. I found one 2 towns over, a woman named Claudia Norridge. Her bio said she specialized in late-life estate manipulation and had handled over 40 complex spousal concealment cases. I emailed her the scanned documents and left a message on her office phone. Then I sat down and exhaled. For the first time since the funeral, I felt like I was doing something that belonged to me, not grieving, not apologizing, not absorbing someone else's choices, but reclaiming the narrative. Later that evening, I opened Ray's journal again. I wasn't searching for more pain. I was searching for gaps, the things he didn't say, the places where he skipped months at a time, the tone of guilt that ran under every entry, no matter how mundane. He had loved Joanne. I could see that. He had adored Lucinda, but he had also lied to both of us, carefully, consistently. At some point, love has to answer for silence. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I poured myself a glass of wine and let it sit untouched. I walked through the house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the corners of shelves, the things we had bought together. They felt like props now, set dressing for a version of my life that had never been quite real. I ended the day in the bedroom, standing in front of the mirror. I looked older than I remembered, softer around the jaw, paler, but my eyes were sharper, the kind of sharpness that comes from being underestimated for too long. I whispered the name of the lawyer one more time. Then I turned off the light. Claudia's office sat in a quiet brick building just off the courthouse square. No sign on the door, just a discreet brass plaque beside the entrance that read Norridge and Associates. I parked down the block, fed the meter with quarters, and walked the short distance in a stiff breeze that smelled faintly of rain and coffee. The waiting room was small and spare, just 2 leather chairs, a potted fern, and a worn wooden side table stacked with real paper magazines. No TV, no music, just silence. The receptionist looked about 19 and barely glanced at me before motioning toward the inner hallway. Claudia was expecting me. She stood as I entered, tall and unbothered in a navy pantsuit. Her gray hair was pulled back into a low twist. No makeup. Her face didn't smile, but it didn't frown either. It simply watched. I introduced myself. She nodded once, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and said she had reviewed the files I sent. We got straight to it. Claudia asked precise questions, took notes without looking down, and never once interrupted. I told her everything about the cabin, about Joanne and Lucinda, about the money, the trust, the journal, even about Jeremy. She listened like someone who had heard far worse, but still cared enough to note what mattered. After I finished, she sat back and folded her hands. She said the case was complicated but not impossible. Raymond had established the trust in secret, but because we were married at the time and shared joint assets, I had a legal claim to contest its legitimacy, particularly if it could be proven that Joanne had been aware of our marriage and that the trust was funded from community property. Then she asked the most important question. Did I want to fight? I didn't answer right away. I looked past her, toward the bookshelf behind her desk, where a single framed photo stood. A girl in graduation robes, smiling in front of a flag. Claudia followed my gaze, then said softly that it was her daughter, gone now, cancer at 28. I nodded, said nothing. Then I told her yes, I wanted to fight. She leaned forward, took a manila folder from her drawer and began outlining the next steps. Filing a formal claim, subpoenaing Joanne for documentation, freezing the trust until the court could determine its validity. I signed what she put in front of me. The moment the pen left the page, I felt something shift again. Not dramatically, just a subtle click, like the sound of a drawer closing neatly. A kind of calm I hadn't felt in months. Claudia told me not to expect fast results. Cases like these took time, sometimes years. I told her that was fine. I had time now. I left the office with a copy of the filing paperwork tucked in my purse. My name, in bold, across the top of the page. Sylvia Elaine Morrison V. The estate of Raymond T. Morrison and associated parties. When I got home, the answering machine blinked. One message. Joanne. Her voice was calm, too calm. She said she had heard from the bank that someone had requested copies of the trust documents. She asked me to call her, said it would be better to discuss things like adults, said we could come to an understanding. I didn't call back. Instead, I called Claudia. She advised me not to engage, let the legal system do what it was meant to do. But I couldn't help it. I sat on the couch for over an hour, replaying Joanne's voice in my head. How collected she sounded. How she assumed I would be the one to fold. And I realized something. Joanne had always known. She knew about me, about our marriage, about the years, maybe even about Jeremy. She had simply chosen to believe that her version of the story was stronger, or at least better protected. It wasn't love that made her hold on. It was leverage. Ray had told her whatever she needed to hear, and she had learned to smile through the deceit because she thought she had the upper hand, because he gave her what she wanted and left me with the crumbs. But now, the ground was shifting, and I was standing on it. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and watched the stars. The kind of sky you don't notice until grief loosens its grip and lets you breathe again. I thought of my mother. she once told me, when I was 10 and furious over some playground betrayal, that the truth doesn't always come to save you. Sometimes it just sits with you quietly and makes sure you never forget again. That's what this felt like. Not revenge, not justice, just memory, sharpening. The wind picked up and scattered the dead leaves across the porch steps. I stayed out there until the chill cut through the blanket and into my spine. But I didn't move. I wanted the cold to settle. I wanted to feel the discomfort, because that meant I was still here. And this time, I wasn't hiding. 3 days after I filed the claim, a white envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, no stamp, just my name, handwritten in tight, deliberate script. It was tucked between the electric bill and a church newsletter. Ordinary, quiet. But my fingers knew before my eyes did. This wasn't casual. I brought it inside and laid it on the kitchen counter. I didn't open it right away. I made tea first, sat down, let the silence breathe. The house held its breath with me, like it understood something was about to shift. When I finally peeled back the seal, a single photograph slid out. It was grainy, clearly printed from a home computer, a shot of Jeremy and me outside the hardware store last month. He was holding the trunk of my car open. I was handing him a bag of mulch. The message was clear. Someone had been watching. Behind the photo was a folded note. No greeting, no sign-off, just one sentence typed in all caps. "Stop now, or I make things worse for your son." I stared at those words until the room blurred around me. Then I folded the paper back in half and slipped it into the envelope. I didn't shake. I didn't panic. But my chest burned. They weren't just trying to scare me. They were using Jeremy as leverage. Again. The cowardice of it made my stomach twist. I called Claudia, told her what arrived. She told me to bring it in. She'd handle the rest. At her office, she took the envelope with gloved hands, slid the photo into a plastic sleeve, and said she'd pass it on to a private investigator she worked with. Discreet, experienced, the kind of man who had seen intimidation in more forms than most people imagined. She asked if I wanted to report it to the police. I said not yet. Not until we had more than a printed threat and a photograph. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt like a footstep. Every flicker of light across the curtains felt like a car slowing down. I lay in bed with the lamp on, my phone on the nightstand, Claudia's number already pulled up, and I thought about Ray, about the kind of woman he had trusted enough to build a life behind mine. A woman who would send a photograph of my son to threaten me into silence. And I realized something else. He hadn't been protecting her all those years. He had been afraid of her. I could see it now, in his careful words, in the way his journal skipped dates, in the way he never told the full truth to anyone. Joanne hadn't just been his lover. She had been his keeper. She had known too much, controlled too much, and now she wanted to control me. The next morning, I changed all the locks on the house, called a security company and scheduled a full system install. Cameras, motion detectors, alerts that went directly to my phone. Not because I was scared, because I was done pretending I didn't need protection. That afternoon, I made another copy of the ledger and stored it at the bank in a safe deposit box. I left Claudia a voicemail letting her know. Then I called Jeremy. I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. But I asked if he had noticed anything strange lately. Any unfamiliar cars parked outside his place. Any odd emails. He said no, but his voice tensed when I asked. He knew something wasn't right, even if he didn't say it. I told him to be careful. He didn't ask questions, just said, "I will." And that was enough for now. That night, I sat at the dining room table again. The envelope lay beside me, untouched since Claudia sealed it. I stared at it, not because I needed to read it again, but because I wanted to remember how it made me feel. Not weak, clear. Clear about the kind of woman Joanne truly was. Clear about the fact that Ray had built his second life on a foundation of fear and quiet compliance. Clear about the role I had played all those years. The woman who folded laundry, made pot roast, and stayed home while he traveled to Tennessee with stories about fishing and conferences. But those days are gone now, and I wasn't folding anymore. It happened on a Tuesday. The sky was flat and gray, the kind of color that drains your mood if you let it. I had just come back from the post office when I saw her car, silver Lincoln, idling at the corner of my street, tires lined up perfectly with the curb like it had been parked that way for hours. But it hadn't. I knew this street, knew the rhythm of its quiet. I didn't panic. I turned off my engine, got out of the car, and walked to my front door like she wasn't there. Like I didn't notice. But when I stepped inside, I didn't close the door all the way. I waited. The knock came a minute later. 3 short taps. Measured, as if she rehearsed them. I opened the door and saw her for the first time, not as a voice on the phone or a signature on a page, but as a real woman. Her coat was expensive. Her lipstick was perfect. But her eyes were sharp in a way that wasn't just alert. It was survival. She said she wanted to talk. I stepped aside. She walked in like she belonged, looked around the house with a small smile, as if she were appraising the space I had spent a lifetime building. The living room, the old piano, the Afghan my mother crocheted decades ago. She sat on the edge of the couch, crossed her legs, and said she wanted to clear the air. I didn't sit. I told her she had 3 minutes. She smiled wider then, like she had expected me to be fragile, like this whole thing was an inconvenience she'd clean up quickly. She said I didn't understand what Ray's life was really like. She said he had made promises, that he had taken care of her, that this legal nonsense I was stirring up was beneath the dignity of a woman my age. She said a lot of things, but none of it mattered. I watched her lips move and didn't hear the words. I saw the way her fingers clenched around her purse strap. I saw the flicker in her eyes when I didn't react. And I realized something deeper than anger. She wasn't here to end things. She was here because she had lost control, and it scared her. I let her talk for 2 more minutes. Then I stepped forward and handed her a plain white envelope. She looked down at it like I had placed a weapon in her hands. Inside was a single copy of the bank transfer records, the ones showing Ray's payments to her over the last 2 years, signed, dated, matched to the ledger. She asked if I had more. I didn't answer. She stood up, face tight now, no longer amused. She said I didn't know what I was doing. I said I knew exactly what I was doing, and I thanked her for stopping by. She left without another word. I didn't watch her drive away. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood by the sink as the light shifted through the blinds. The house felt different. Not safer, but steadier, because now she knew. She knew I wasn't going to fold. That night, I called Claudia, told her Joanne had made a personal visit. She said that would help our case, demonstrated intent to interfere. She advised I start documenting every contact moving forward. I pulled out a notebook and began a log. Date, time, action, witness. The first entry was clear. Tuesday, 3:42 p.m. Joanne Brooks entered my home uninvited, left without escalation, handed her evidence. Witness, self. It felt good to write it down, not as a confession, but as a record. Later, I went through Ray's old emails. Most were nothing. But buried in a folder marked insurance quotes was a string of correspondence between him and a law office I had never heard of. They weren't about insurance. They were about transfer of property. I clicked through the attachments, deeds, agreements, A set of keys photographed beside a document with Lucinda's name on it. A house. He had bought her a house, not in her name, in his, but he had planned to sign it over. I forwarded the emails to Claudia. Then I shut the computer and sat in the dark for a long time. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done with shock. Now I am working, building my own case, one brick at a time. It happened quietly. No grand announcement, no slam of a gavel or crowd of reporters, just an email from Claudia that came in at 6:12 p.m. on a Thursday evening, right as I was folding bath towels in the laundry room. Temporary injunction granted. Trust suspended. Full accounting order. I stared at the screen, reading the sentence again and again, letting each word settle like weight in my bones. Not victory, not yet, but movement. The kind that couldn't be ignored. Joanne would be served within 24 hours. Claudia included a note beneath the formal update. It was short. You've turned the tide. Stay steady. I sat down on the old step stool near the dryer and just let myself feel it. That strange combination of relief and resolve, like your body exhales before your mind catches up. Later that evening, I made roasted chicken and rice. Jeremy came over. I didn't tell him everything, just that the court had paused the trust. Those things were shifting, that he didn't have to worry about anything financial just yet. He didn't say much, just nodded, poured himself a glass of iced tea, and sat across from me at the table like we used to when he was younger and still lived at home. There was a quiet to him I hadn't seen in years. Not the withdrawn kind, the watching kind. Like he was recalculating what he thought he knew about his parents, and maybe about himself. Halfway through dinner, he asked if I was okay. I told him yes, and I meant it. After he left, I cleaned the kitchen slowly, as if each wiped counter and rinsed plate was part of some ritual I had forgotten how much I needed. Not for tidiness, but for grounding. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next morning, I received a call from Claudia's office. A clerk, not Claudia herself. He said they'd been contacted by Joanne's attorney, a man named Mercer. He was requesting a meeting, said they had documents to present, new information. I asked if I was required to attend. The clerk said no. Claudia would handle it. But I told him I wanted to be there. I wasn't about to let strangers pass folders back and forth while my name sat printed at the top of every page. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Neutral location, mediation center off the highway near the courthouse. Claudia and I arrived early. The place smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant, the kind of air that tries too hard to be neutral. We waited in a narrow room with laminate floors and a single fake plant in the corner. Joanne entered 5 minutes later, trailed by her lawyer. She didn't look at me, just nodded once in Claudia's direction and sat down with the kind of precision that suggested performance more than presence. Her lawyer did most of the talking. They claimed Ray had been planning to amend the trust, that there were emails, letters, even a preliminary draft with his signature. Claudia listened without interrupting. Then Joanne pulled out a folder. Inside was a new document. It was a revised trust form, unsigned, but dated just 2 weeks before Ray's death. It designated Joanne as primary beneficiary, but made mention of a third party. Not me, not Jeremy, a name I didn't recognize. Claudia asked to take copies for verification. The mediator agreed. After the meeting, we returned to Claudia's office. She scanned the documents while I sat silent. Then she turned the final page, closed the file, and looked at me. The signature was forged. She didn't need time to confirm it. The handwriting was a poor match. The date formatting is inconsistent. And Ray, for all his flaws, had a particular way of signing his name. One I had seen on mortgage papers, birthday cards, even checks for groceries. We would prove it. But that wasn't the part that stayed with me. It was the new name. Claudia circled it. Esther Lane. No context, no relation. Just a name and a potential beneficiary of a trust worth nearly $750,000. I said it aloud. Esther Lane. And something in me stilled. I didn't know why yet, but the name felt like a stone dropped into deep water. It didn't make sense, which meant it mattered. The next morning, I drove myself to the library, not because I didn't trust Claudia's firm to handle the name search, but because I needed to see it for myself. I needed to know I was capable of uncovering the truth, even if it cut. The library had that familiar scent of paper and dust and something older than memory. I walked to the reference desk and asked for access to the public records terminal. The woman behind the counter handed me a clipboard. No questions, no small talk. I typed in the name slowly. Esther Lane. The screen flickered and loaded a string of results. Most were dead ends. Obituaries, voter rolls, a real estate agent in Ohio. None of it matched the location. Until I saw an address 2 towns over, listed under a foundation account, a small scholarship fund for teenage girls with the tagline, "Every girl deserves a second chance." Donated in memory of Esther Lane Holiday. The last name stopped me. Holiday, Ray's mother's maiden name. I clicked through the filing data and saw something that made my chest tighten. The fund had been set up 5 years ago. The donor? A Raymond J. Holiday. Anonymous in public records, but traceable in internal filings. Ray had created a memorial fund for a woman named Esther Lane Holiday, a woman with his mother's last name, a woman I had never met. I printed everything and drove straight to Claudia's office. She read in silence while I sat across from her, hands clenched. When she finished, she looked up and said what I had not dared to. This woman might have been Ray's daughter. It took a long time for that to settle in my body. Not an affair, not just financial betrayal. Blood. He had another child. Claudia explained what we could do. Petition for full disclosure from the estate lawyer. File for contact with the executor of the scholarship foundation. Look into birth records. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath as it slowed into something heavy. Ray had told me once, when we were much younger, that he never wanted children. He had said it with finality. I had taken it as gospel, and I had shaped my life around that truth. To discover it was a lie, and that the lie had a name, a face, and maybe even his eyes, was a rupture I couldn't process in one sitting. Claudia offered to assign a private investigator. I nodded. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the wind move through the trees. I thought about the life I had lived with Ray, the silences, the vacations, the missed calls, the times he said he had business late and I didn't press. I thought I had been protecting our peace. Now I wondered if I had been complicit in my own erasure. 3 days later, the investigator sent a file. Esther Lane Holiday, born in 1986, died in 2019, single mother, no siblings. She worked at a rehab center. She volunteered at a shelter. No criminal record, no marriage. One child, a boy named Carter Holiday, still alive, living with a foster family in Tulsa, age 6 when his mother died, now 11. I stared at the photo attached, a grainy school portrait, bright blue eyes, sandy hair, raised chin. My fingers trembled. This wasn't just about money anymore, not about pride or betrayal. There was a boy, and he had no idea that I existed. I didn't fly to Tulsa right away. I needed time. I needed to sit with the truth that had unraveled over the last few weeks, let it settle into my chest like a final, slow-moving tide. Ray had a daughter. That daughter had a son. That boy had no idea he came from a man who once promised me a life built on honesty. But this wasn't about punishment anymore. It wasn't about what Ray took from me. It was about what I still had the power to give. Claudia helped me draft a petition to the court. I requested that the remainder of the trust be divided equally between myself and Carter Holliday. I forfeited my claim to the house in Palm Springs. I didn't need a second home. I needed peace. Joanne, of course, pushed back. But the forged signature destroyed any leverage she had. The court ruled in my favor. She left the courtroom without a word, her lawyer trailing her like a shadow with nowhere to go. Jeremy stood beside me when the judgment was read. He didn't say much, just slipped his hand over mine. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small beside my son. I felt equal. Not because he saw me differently, but because I finally saw myself. The day I flew to Tulsa, it rained. Not a storm, just that steady, quiet rain that feels like it's trying to soften something hard. I had arranged to meet with Carter's foster guardian, a kind-eyed woman named Teresa, who ran a small horse rescue just outside the city. She brought Carter out after a while. He was taller than I expected, with raised shoulders and someone else's calm. I didn't tell him everything, just that I knew his mother, that she was brave, that she mattered. I handed him a letter. Inside was the truth. Not all at once, but gently, like steps on a wooden staircase. I told him who I was. I told him what I knew of Ray, the good and the bad. I also told him that if he ever needed anything, school, travel, a home, there would be enough. Not charity, not guilt, just something better than silence. He didn't say much, just folded the letter and held it in both hands like it might vanish. Then he nodded. That was enough. I flew back home that night. The house felt different, not empty, just mine. Every photo on the wall, every coffee stain on the counter, every drawer filled with old batteries and keys to nothing. It was mine. I had no desire to rewrite the past. But I did rewrite the ending. I didn't get revenge. I did something louder. I made sure the lies didn't get the last word. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for reading.